The year was 1914. A small island where there was no city, no crowd of people, just a lighthouse and a mystery hidden deep in the ocean. The film begins by showing a ship sailing through the South Atlantic Ocean moving toward its destination. On board that ship was a weather officer named David. They were heading to an island located in one of the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean. The government had sent David there to observe the island's changing weather patterns. David was supposed to stay there for about a year to collect data, study the strange shifts in the climate, and then return. The captain was taking David to the island along with a year's supply of food and all necessary equipment. After a long journey, they finally reached the island. With the help of a boat, they disembarked and brought their supplies along. There was a lighthouse on the island and a small house where David was supposed to live. A weather officer had been living there before him, but his duty had ended. From today onward, David was the new weather officer of this island. The former officer Robert was to return home aboard Captain Axel's ship. But when they entered the house, they were shocked. There was no sign of any human. The room's furniture was scattered and everything seemed completely disorganized. Perhaps someone was still in the lighthouse. Without wasting time, Captain and David headed towards it. What they saw there was even stranger. The lighthouse was completely surrounded by sharp-pointed wooden spikes, as if someone had deliberately barricaded it so that no one could get in. Captain and David knocked several times on the gate, but there was no response. Finally, they pushed the door forcefully and entered. At the very top of the lighthouse, they found a man named Gruner. He was lying down. When they asked him about the previous weather officer, he replied very casually, "He's dead. Some terrible illness got him." When the captain asked about the dead body, Gruner gave an even stranger answer, "Maybe someone killed him." Listening to Gruner, both David and the captain were stunned. They began to think Gruner might not be mentally stable. But until they could find out what really happened to the former officer, they couldn't do anything. Captain told David, "If you want, you can still come back with us." But David knew if he could give the government an accurate weather report of this island, he could earn a good amount of money, and he really needed that money. So he decided to stay. The captain gave him a gun for protection. Maybe this place wasn't as safe as it looked. After the ship left, David began settling into the house to make it livable. In one of the drawers in the room, he found a diary belonging to the former officer. That officer had arrived on the island back in 1913. The diary had many notes about the island, but everything wasn't clear. Some things were incomplete. David carefully read each line. There were also some strange sketches of odd-looking creatures in the diary. David couldn't understand why he had drawn such images. Maybe he was alone and did it to pass the time. On one of the pages there was a photo of his wife. Reading through the diary, David eventually grew tired and dozed off. The next morning David began his work. But as soon as he reached near the sea, he froze. Among the rocks, some stones were arranged in a peculiar way, and in between them were seashells placed in a strange pattern. David thought, maybe this is just... David assumed it must have been Gruner and went back to his work, collecting weather data, the very task he had come here for. During his work, when he looked toward the lighthouse through his binoculars, he saw someone standing with Gruner. But then he thought, maybe it's just my imagination. Night had fallen and David was still busy with his work when suddenly someone knocked at the door. He assumed it must be Gruner. David called out his name but got no response. Carrying a lamp in his hand, David moved forward, but strange sounds started echoing in his ears. And then he saw it. A grotesque, inhuman hand was trying to reach in through the gap under the door. That hand wasn't human at all. David's heart filled with terror. He ran straight to the basement and hid there. Within moments, that mysterious creature had broken into the house. It was searching for David, moving around stealthily. Through a small crack in the basement wall, David could see the creature's terrifying eyes staring right at him. David picked up a knife, and the moment those eyes came close to the crack, he stabbed the knife with all his might. The creature shrieked and fled, but it could return at any moment. David tightly shut the basement door, tied it with rope, and spent the whole night wide awake, in complete fear. The next morning, when David stepped outside the house, he noticed some strange footprints in the sand. They didn't look human at all. It was now absolutely clear, this wasn't the work of any person. The footprints led straight to the sea and disappeared. Now David understood why Gruner had surrounded the lighthouse with sharp wooden spikes. It must have been to keep that creature away. And now David knew, the house was no longer safe for him. That creature might return tonight. Scared, David ran toward the lighthouse. He shouted to Gruner, "Open the gate. Let me in." But Gruner refused and yelled back, "You should have gone back with that ship." Heartbroken, David returned to his house. But now he had to make it more secure. He sealed every window with wooden planks, surrounded the place with sharp stakes and placed old papers and books outside the main gate. He poured oil on them, so if the creature returned he could scare it away with fire. But there was one thing David still didn't know, and he was about to discover it that very night. By luck he found an old box inside the house. Inside it was a gun and a lot of bullets. That gave him a little courage, but the fear still lingered. As the sun began to set, darkness fell across the island. David sat silently in a corner of the house, holding the gun in his hand, breathing heavily. Suddenly a strange noise echoed. When David stepped toward the window, he froze in shock. It wasn't just one. Several of those bizarre creatures were rising out of the water, and they were all heading straight for his house. Within moments they began trying to break down the gate. David immediately opened fire. Some of the creatures fell, but the rest became even more violent. They began forcing their way into the house. As their numbers increased, David didn't waste a second. He set fire to the papers and books outside the gate. Seeing the flames, the creatures became afraid and retreated back into the sea. But now the fire had spread to David's house. And since the whole structure was made of wood, the flames spread like lightning. David quickly wrapped himself in a blanket, broke down the door and escaped. He ran toward the lighthouse and hid behind a large rock nearby. His right hand was badly burned. But by sheer luck, rain began to pour. Gradually the flames started dying down. But even after an entire night of heavy rain, by morning David couldn't save his house. It was completely burned to ashes. Now if David wanted to survive, he had only one option left: to take shelter in the lighthouse. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. When Gruner came outside to fetch water, David followed him silently. His plan was to hold him at gunpoint and force his way into the lighthouse. But suddenly Gruner pointed a gun at him. And just then a strange creature standing next to Gruner lunged to attack David. That creature was actually Gruner's protector. Gruner quickly stopped David and said, "It's my pet." David didn't fire, but he made a deal. If he was to stay alive, he needed to be allowed into the lighthouse. He had enough gunpowder to last a year and plenty of food, enough for both of them. Gruner stayed silent for a moment, then finally nodded in agreement. Before evening they brought the remaining supplies and returned to the lighthouse together. The next morning that same creature was quietly licking David's burnt hand while he was fast asleep. And within a few minutes his hand had started to heal significantly. It was a shock for David. Something unbelievable was happening right before his eyes. From the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting the bullets they had, and that same creature was helping Gruner in its own way. This meant that the creature wasn't inherently violent. David now wanted to know more about it from Gruner. He even dreamed of presenting this discovery to the world, because this was nothing short of a miracle. A strange female sea creature emerging from the depths of the ocean stood before them. If the truth about her came out, both David and Gruner could become world famous. But Gruner wasn't interested in any of that. He didn't want to leave the island. Gruner had no family, no one of his own. According to him, in society no one can ever truly be free. Everyone ends up being someone's servant or slave. That's why for him this island was perfect. Here he considered himself a king, the master of his own world. That's why he had carved the phrase, "Gruner is king," in many places across the island. But how had that strange female creature become his pet? The truth was, one day Gruner had saved her life. She had accidentally gotten trapped in one of his fishing nets. At that time she was still small. From that day onward she started living with him, obeying his every command. But Gruner was an angry, cruel man. He never treated the creature with kindness. He regularly forced physical relations on her. Once the creature tried to attack Gruner, and in response he gave her a punishment so brutal that she began to consider herself his servant. That's probably why every night creatures from the sea came ashore, trying to take her back. But they couldn't attack during daylight. Meanwhile, David had made up his mind. He didn't want to stay here any longer. He wanted to send a signal to any passing ship and leave this island as soon as possible. But it wasn't that easy. Gruner insisted that no ships came near this island. But David didn't believe him. He was starting to feel suffocated, like this place was crushing his soul. He was desperate to leave. Evening was approaching. Gruner warned him, "Get the gun ready, those creatures could attack at any moment." They prepared to turn on the lighthouse light. And within moments a huge number of creatures began rising from the ocean, moving straight toward the lighthouse. Gruner began firing relentlessly at them. But David, he was completely paralyzed with fear. David began to retreat inside the lighthouse. Even though Gruner kept shouting at him to help, David just sat quietly in a corner. And after a while, he fainted. Gruner had to fight off the creatures alone that night. The next morning Gruner angrily woke him up and said, "If you want to stay in the lighthouse, you'll have to follow every order I give you. Fetch water daily, handle the chores, and take turns at night guard duty." David didn't have a choice anymore. If he wanted to stay alive, he had to stay in the lighthouse. Now he was ready to do everything Gruner asked. But there was one thing that David could never get used to: Gruner's daily physical abuse of the female creature. Still, David thought to himself, someone who had lived alone on this godforsaken island for years, it's only natural that his mental state would be disturbed. But even if he didn't agree, he had to obey. Night fell again and the two men prepared for guard duty. Once more the creatures rose from the sea and headed toward them. But this time, David wasn't afraid. He fired at them bravely. But today Gruner did something unexpected. He didn't fight back at all. Instead, he locked the lighthouse gate from inside, leaving David outside alone. Gruner sat inside calmly, forcing David to learn how to fight the creatures on his own. Otherwise he'd either learn or die. David screamed for help, but Gruner didn't come. Somehow David survived the night. In the morning when Gruner opened the gate, he found David sitting bloodied and bruised but alive. David had finally learned how to fight. His fear was gone. Time passed like this, fighting the creatures at night and doing Gruner's chores during the day. This island had become like a prison for David. He constantly thought, when will I leave this place? When will I be free? But slowly something unexpected happened. David started forming a strange bond with the female creature. He began to feel bad for her. He now understood what it meant to be alone, to be away from your kind, to live in isolation. Maybe she felt the same. He even gave her a name, Aneris. And then one day they noticed something odd. The attacks were reducing. David thought, maybe it's winter and the creatures are migrating somewhere else like whales, or maybe they've realized it's useless to keep attacking us. But Gruner disagreed. No, they'll be back. They're reproducing now. Their numbers are growing. A few more days passed. One night after dinner, Gruner and David began to play chess to pass the time. But during the game, Gruner made a huge mistake. They got so engrossed in the game they forgot to turn on the lighthouse light. And in the darkness, the creatures launched a surprise attack. David saw that the creatures had bred. There were dozens and dozens of them now. Far too many for two people to fight off. Their ammunition was almost gone. Somehow, dodging and defending themselves, they climbed to the top of the lighthouse. But in the process, Gruner's leg got badly injured. The creatures were now trying to break into the lighthouse. David and Gruner could see no way out. They were ready to accept defeat. But then morning arrived. As the first rays of the sun lit the horizon, the creatures slowly retreated back into the sea. Aneris tried to heal Gruner's wounds with her powers. But by now David had realized something very important. It was now clear to David, this fight against the creatures could not be won. The bullets were almost finished and they didn't even have enough food to survive for long. The next day, by sheer luck, while David was wandering near the lighthouse, he saw a ship in the distance. He rushed inside, grabbed a flare gun and ran out to signal the ship. But Gruner stopped him. He didn't want David to leave the island. At that very moment Aneris attacked Gruner. She wanted to protect David from him. Gruner didn't want anyone to leave the island. This island was his world. A place where he reigned like a king, had a servant who obeyed his every word and lived on his own terms. He had no interest in going back to the city. And he didn't want David to leave either. After being alone for so long, Gruner had finally found someone to talk to. Slowly the ship faded away before David's eyes into the ocean. There was nothing more he could do. A few more days passed. Gruner continued mistreating both David and Aneris. But he was especially cruel to her, something David couldn't stand. One day David gifted Aneris a small toy boat he had made using whale bones, hoping it might comfort her somehow. But when Aneris saw the boat, she led David to a hidden corner of the island, and there to his shock was a real boat. When David asked Gruner about it, he casually said yes, he already knew about it. A few months ago, an arms smuggling ship carrying explosives had wrecked near the island due to a storm. Some of the crew had managed to reach the island using that boat, but none of them survived the night. The creatures had killed them all. Hearing this, an idea sparked in David's mind. They had something resembling a diving suit. If someone could wear it and dive to that wreck, maybe they could retrieve some bullets or dynamite, which would make it easier to fight the monsters. But Gruner flatly refused. He didn't even want to go near that ocean again. David, however, was willing to risk his life. A few more days passed. In the meantime, David and Aneris developed a deep bond. David started to genuinely care for her. Gruner noticed this from a distance, and for the first time a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he should help David. But Gruner had an ulterior motive. He wanted David to dive and retrieve the dynamite, and once he had what he needed, he planned to leave David down there to die, letting the creatures kill him. That way Gruner would have the dynamite and Aneris would once again be his helpless prisoner. Both of them reached the location. David wore the diving suit and dove into the sea. The shipwreck was completely destroyed, but luckily he found a few boxes of dynamite. Just then the creatures appeared. David panicked and fell. The iron diving suit was so heavy he couldn't even move. He couldn't signal Gruner for help either. Gruner assumed the creatures had killed David. But in truth there were only 2 young creatures there. David quickly adjusted the pressure in his suit, left it behind underwater, and swam up to the surface on his own. There they found some old boxes containing dynamite. Together they laid it out around the lighthouse in 2 layers, hoping that if there was another attack they could wipe out the monsters in one massive blast. Months passed. Snow began to fall, and once again the creatures mysteriously disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Now their main task was to keep the lighthouse running and maintain a constant watch. Gruner's patience had worn thin. He suspected that Aneris might have revealed their dynamite plan to the creatures, which is why they were no longer attacking. Furious, he lost control and began beating Aneris. But David intervened and stopped him. Eventually David and Gruner came up with a new plan. They would leave the main gate of the lighthouse open. As soon as the creatures entered, they would blow them up using the dynamite. Soon enough the creatures emerged from the ocean. They moved directly toward the main gate and attacked David the moment they got inside. David fought back bravely, clashing with the monsters. As the creatures reached the lighthouse, Gruner pulled the dynamite lever, but nothing happened. The blast didn't go off. David had disconnected the wire earlier and had forgotten to reconnect it. Realizing this, he quickly ran upstairs and began fixing the wiring. Meanwhile, the creatures started climbing the lighthouse. Gruner tried to stop them alone. As soon as David finished reconnecting the wires, he triggered the first layer of dynamite. Many of the creatures were killed in the explosion, but several more were still attacking. Seeing no other option, Gruner detonated the second layer as well. The massive blast knocked both of them unconscious. The next morning, when they regained consciousness, Aneris was gone. Dead creature bodies were scattered everywhere. Gruner was killing the few wounded ones who had survived. Then David noticed something: a necklace hanging from the neck of one of the creatures. In that moment he realized the terrible truth. The creatures they had always believed to be violent were actually intelligent, maybe even civilized. They just couldn't speak. Perhaps there was a reason they attacked the lighthouse. But to Gruner none of this mattered. In his mind he was the king of the island and everyone was expected to follow his rule. After that day the creatures never attacked in the same way again. But from the edge of the ocean a sorrowful cry could be heard every day. David still didn't understand the extent of the damage they had caused, how many families were destroyed, how many children had lost their loved ones, all because of a misunderstanding. The next day David saw a few young creatures near the sea, the ones who had lost their families. He placed a circle of stones and placed the small toy boat in the center, hoping Aneris would return. But no matter how long he waited, Aneris never came back. One morning David found Gruner unconscious. Scattered around him were some old belongings, including an old photograph. As soon as David looked at the photo, he was stunned. The girl he had seen in Gruner's diary on the first day wasn't just anyone, she was Gruner's wife. Gruner, whose real name was Robert, had once been a weather officer assigned to this lighthouse. He had arrived on this island almost a year ago. After losing everything, he had changed his name and decided never to leave. Seeing all this, David gave up hope of ever escaping the island. The next evening, while walking by the sea, David noticed something odd. The small toy boat he had left in the stone circle was no longer there. In its place stood a small creature, a child, holding the boat in its hands. Quietly, David tossed his torchlight into the center of the circle. To show he meant no harm, that he didn't want to fight, David gently placed his torch in the circle. He wanted to show the creatures he wished to be their friend. Moments later, from the ocean waves, Aneris emerged. Behind her, the entire group of sea creatures slowly rose from the water. But this time no one attacked David, because now they too wanted peace. All they ever wanted was a safe place for their children, just like any other living being. The sudden intrusion of humans on their island had disturbed them deeply. That's why they attacked every night. But who could explain this to Gruner? He still considered himself the king of this island. Gruner walked out of the lighthouse with a gun in his hand. David tried to reason with him, telling him the creatures didn't want war, they wanted peace. But Gruner refused to listen. He yelled at Aneris, ordering her to go inside. But for the first time, Aneris disobeyed him. She was no longer his servant. She was a mother now, standing strong for her children. Gruner felt a wave of weakness inside. No one was following his commands anymore. Enraged, he stepped toward the lighthouse. David thought maybe Gruner had finally understood that every creature just wants freedom. No one wants to live as a slave. But Gruner wasn't a reasonable man anymore. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he fired a signal flare straight toward the creatures, and it hit a young child. The little creature died instantly. Terrified, all the other creatures ran back into the sea. And Aneris, who once trusted David, now turned her back on him. That trust was shattered. Furious and heartbroken, David rushed into the lighthouse. He clashed violently with Gruner. Why did you do this? They just wanted peace. But Gruner was too far gone. He had become so violent he raised an axe to kill David. Just as he was about to strike, David called out his real name, Robert. Gruner froze, because Robert was someone he no longer recognized. The man who once came to this island was lost, buried under years of isolation, grief and mental breakdown after his wife's death. Gruner was never truly a monster. He wasn't a killer. He was just a broken man who had lost everything. He had attacked the creatures to feel powerful and to feel in control. But now he realized how wrong he had been. And so Gruner, or rather Robert, surrendered himself to the creatures. Within moments they killed him. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time passed, and 1 year later a government officer arrived on the island, along with a new weather officer. David was taken away. The new officer began monitoring the weather from the lighthouse, unaware of the island's haunting past. But he mistook David for Gruner. And David didn't correct him. He silently walked out to the balcony and just stood there, saying nothing, because now he too didn't want to leave the island, just like Gruner once did. Meanwhile, Aneris was finally free, living peacefully with her family without fear of men like Gruner. They were safe now, on the island and in the ocean, free to live the way they were always meant to.